My name is Camille Ashworth. I am 31 years old. I am a civil rights attorney in Charleston, South Carolina, and 3 weeks before the largest federal hearing of my career, my own brother stole my identity to take out an $85,000 loan using the social security number our parents gave me the day I was born. This is what I did next, and I will warn you now, it does not end the way family stories are supposed to end. I found the loan at 11:42 on a Tuesday night. I was in my office, running the final pass on a case file I had spent 18 months building, representing 37 dockworker families against a shipping conglomerate that had underpaid them for 6 straight years. The hearing was set for the 22nd of the following month. I had been preparing for that single day for 11 months, and I had promised myself I would not let anything touch it. I was not looking for the loan. I was looking at a routine fraud alert from my bank, flagging unusual activity on a credit line I barely used. I almost closed it without reading past the subject line. Almost. But I am a lawyer, and lawyers do not skip past the word unusual. So I opened it. The number on the screen was $85,000. The signature on the digital loan documents was mine, or something built to pass as mine close enough that I had to zoom in 3 separate times before I could convince myself I had not simply forgotten signing it myself, which is its own kind of horror, doubting your own hands. The disbursement date was 19 days earlier. 19 days. Someone had been sitting on that money, walking around in the world as a version of me that owed $85,000, while the real me went to work every morning without the faintest idea she had been replaced. I did not stand up. I did not call anyone. I sat very still and opened the loan confirmation email, and I read the recovery address it had been sent to, not my email, not one I recognized at all. But the first part of that address stopped my blood cold before I had even finished reading it. It was a nickname. A nickname exactly one person on this earth had ever called me, since I was 12 years old, and no one else had ever known existed outside our family kitchen table. Cammie. Not a stranger who'd bought my data off some breach forum. Someone who had eaten dinner across from me every Thanksgiving for 31 years. Someone who had watched me learn to walk. Someone who knew exactly where the soft tissue of my life was, and had chosen the 3 weeks before the most important hearing of my career to put a knife in it. Marcus, my brother, 34 years old, preparing to launch his own financial consulting firm the same week I was scheduled to walk into a federal courtroom. The same Marcus I had quietly wired money to for 8 years every time he called himself temporarily tight. The same Marcus my parents had trained me, without ever saying it outright, to protect at the cost of protecting myself. Every time I came close to saying something, my mother had the same 4 words ready. You're stronger than him. You understand, don't you? I understood. I had understood for 8 years. But that night, alone in the dark of my office with $85,000 still glowing on the screen, I understood something else for the first time, something I had never once let myself say out loud in all those years. The people I called family had turned me into their financial backstop, long before they were willing to turn me into a criminal on paper. I did not know that night that the loan was only the surface of it. I did not know that when I went looking through an old drawer at my parents' house, I would find a pawn shop receipt for something that was supposed to be sitting in my own desk, where it had sat for 10 years. I did not know that 3 weeks later, I would be standing in a room full of investors in expensive suits, watching my brother raise a glass of champagne to launch a company built on my name. But that night, I knew exactly one thing. As certain as the number still lit up on my screen. I had cleaned up after Marcus for the last time in my life. I just didn't know yet what I was going to have to burn down to make that true. I sat with that number for almost an hour before I did anything at all. Not because I was undecided, I had already decided, somewhere underneath language, the moment I read the word Cammie in that recovery address, but because I understood, in the particular way lawyers understand things, that the first hour after discovering a fraud is the hour that determines whether you become a victim or a plaintiff. Victims react. Plaintiffs document. I have spent 11 years training myself out of the first instinct entirely, and that night, alone in my office with the harbor lights blinking faintly through the blinds, I was grateful, for the first time in my career, that the training had taken. I took a screenshot of the loan confirmation before I did anything else, then a second one with the full browser address bar visible, then a third showing the timestamp in the corner of my monitor. I have told enough juries about the fragility of digital evidence to know that the version of a document you see today is not guaranteed to be the version that exists tomorrow, and I was not going to give anyone, least of all my own brother, the chance to make $85,000 quietly disappear from a server before I had it preserved 3 times over. Only then did I let myself feel anything, and it came out sideways, the way it always has for me, not tears, not right away, but a strange, hollow steadiness in my hands. The same steadiness I remember from the first time I stood in a courtroom at 26 and realized the only thing standing between my clients and a very expensive legal team was whether I could keep my voice from shaking. My hands did not shake that night either. I have wondered since whether that should worry me more than it does. I grew up in a house on the east side of Charleston, the kind with a porch that faced the harbor and a family Bible that had more names crossed out in disagreement than added in celebration. My father ran an insurance agency that had been in his family for 2 generations. My mother kept the books for it, kept the house, and kept the peace, which in our family meant one very specific thing: whatever kept Marcus calm, whatever kept Marcus from feeling like the disappointment everyone quietly suspected he was the correct decision, regardless of what it cost anyone else standing in the room. I was the fixer. Nobody handed me that title in a ceremony. It accumulated, the way debt does, one small transaction at a time, until one day you look up and you owe more than you remember borrowing. It started small. I paid Marcus's rent once in college so my parents wouldn't have to hear about it. Then it was his car payment. Then it was bailing him out quite literally. Once, after a bar fight in his 20s that never made the family group chat because I made 3 phone calls at 2 in the morning and it disappeared. Every time, the same unspoken agreement settled over the house afterward. Camille handled it. Camille always handles it. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being the strong one. Nobody checks on the person who is famous for being fine. My mother would call to ask if Marcus had eaten dinner. She never once called to ask if I had. Marcus had a habit, from childhood, that none of us ever named out loud but all of us had quietly learned to read. Whenever he was about to lie a small lie, a large one, it made no difference. He tapped the table 3 times with his index finger before he opened his mouth. I noticed it when I was 9 and he was 12, denying he'd broken my mother's ceramic bird. Tap, 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 and then, I didn't touch it. He never grew out of it. 22 years later, in boardrooms he was too proud of to invite me into, I imagine his knuckles still found the table before every promise he had no intention of keeping. There was one object in our house that meant something to me, beyond all the others: my grandfather's pocket watch, gold-cased. Its hands stopped at the exact minute he died, which my father had never had repaired because he said a watch that measured your grandfather's death was not a watch that needed to keep telling time. My grandfather had given it to me himself, 2 years before he passed, not to Marcus, and not to my father, to me, specifically, because, he said, I was the only one in the family who understood that some things were worth keeping exactly as broken as they were. I kept it in the second drawer of my desk at home for 10 years. I took it out sometimes on hard nights, turned it over in my hand, and put it back. The night before I found the loan, I remember watering the plants in my office at nearly 10 o'clock, moving slowly from one pot to the next, checking the soil with my finger, the way my grandmother taught me, because I have always believed that the way you treat small, quiet things when no one is watching tells you the truth about what kind of person you actually are. I remember thinking, that night, that I had built a life that was finally mine. A career I had earned with no one's help. A hearing coming that could change labor law for an entire industry in this state. I remember feeling, for one unguarded hour, something close to peace. I did not know I had exactly 1 hour of peace left before I opened that email. There is a specific memory I keep returning to, though I could not tell you why this one, out of thousands, is the one my mind chose to file under Marcus as though it were a label instead of a person. I was 14. He was 17. He had taken $40 from my father's wallet to buy something I never learned the name of, and when my father noticed the money missing, Marcus stood in our kitchen and said, without a flicker of hesitation, that I had probably taken it, that I'd mentioned wanting to buy a birthday gift for a friend, hadn't I? And wasn't $40 about right for that? My father did not believe him, not entirely, but he also did not press it, because pressing it meant an ugly conversation with a 17-year-old who already felt, in his own words, like the family's biggest disappointment, and nobody in that kitchen wanted to be the one to confirm it out loud. So the accusation simply sat there, unresolved, hovering over dinner for a week, until it quietly evaporated the way everything Marcus caused always eventually did, absorbed into the walls of a house that had gotten very good at pretending certain things had never happened. I did not think of that memory again for almost 15 years. It came back to me, whole and vivid, the exact week I found the loan, and I understood then that it hadn't actually left. It had simply been waiting for a moment large enough to justify its return. My father, for what it's worth, was not a cruel man. He was an absent one, in the specific way fathers of a certain generation in a certain kind of house Learn to be absent while still technically living under the same roof, present at dinner, present at church, entirely elsewhere the moment any actual difficulty entered the room. He left the emotional accounting of our family to my mother the way he left the actual accounting of his insurance office to her as well, and my mother, in turn, balanced both ledgers using the same method. Whatever kept the surface calm was correct, regardless of what sank beneath it. The $85,000 loan did not appear out of nowhere, and once I started looking, I understood that it never could have. It was the third wave of something that had been building against me for 8 years, and I had simply never let myself count the water rising until it was already at my chin. The first wave was money, ordinary, forgettable, deniable money. I sat down one night with old bank statements, old Venmo requests, old checks I had written with a note in the memo line that said things like, "for the move" or "just this once," and I added them up for the first time in my life instead of simply writing them off as the cost of loving my brother. Over 8 years, I had given Marcus, directly or indirectly, more than $120,000. Not loaned, given. Because a loan implies an expectation of repayment, and I had stopped expecting repayment somewhere around year 3, the way you stop expecting rain to fall upward. I want to be precise about this, because precision is the only thing that ever protected me in my life. $123,400. I know the number because I built the spreadsheet myself, at my kitchen table, at 1 in the morning, 3 days after I found the loan. I did not build it out of anger. I built it because lawyers do not walk into a fight with feelings. We walk in with documentation. The second wave, I found by accident, the way you find most rot by noticing the smell before you find the source. A credit card statement arrived at my parents' house instead of mine, forwarded to an old address I hadn't lived at in 6 years. My mother mentioned it in passing, the way you'd mention the weather. "Oh, some mail came for you here. I think it's old." I put it on the counter. It was a credit card in my name, opened 4 years earlier, with a balance of $11,000, all of it accrued on things I had never bought, flights I never took, a hotel in Savannah I had never booked a room in, an equipment lease for what I would later learn was Marcus's very first, very short-lived attempt at starting his own business. I confronted my mother about it, calmly, the way I confront hostile witnesses, without raising my voice. Because raised voices give people permission to become defensive instead of honest. And what she told me, in the kitchen where I had grown up watching her protect Marcus from every consequence life had ever tried to hand him, was this. She had known about the card for over a year. She had found out when a collections notice arrived at the house instead of mine, and rather than tell me, she had quietly paid the minimum balance herself, every month, out of a savings account my father didn't know existed, because, in her words, I didn't want it to become a whole thing between you two. "You're both so busy. I just wanted to keep the peace." Keep the peace. I have heard those 3 words my entire life, and it was only in that kitchen, at 31 years old, staring at a woman who had spent a year quietly bleeding money to hide her son's theft from his own sister, that I finally understood what those words had always actually meant. Keeping the peace never meant protecting the family. It meant protecting Marcus from the consequences of being Marcus, at whatever price the rest of us were required to pay, silently, so the surface of the water never had to show a ripple. I asked her, standing in that kitchen, how she had planned to tell me, if she had ever planned to tell me at all. She did not answer right away. She refilled her coffee, though it was already full. She straightened a stack of mail that did not need straightening. And then she said, in a voice so even it frightened me more than shouting would have, I thought it would resolve itself. I asked her what resolution she had imagined, exactly, for an $11,000 balance accruing silently under my name, while I built a legal career that depended, structurally and professionally, on the appearance of a spotless financial record. She did not have an answer for that. I have come to believe, in the months since, that she had never actually pictured an ending to that particular arrangement. She had simply been paying the minimum, month after month, the way you keep watering a plant you already suspect is dead, because stopping would require admitting it. I left that kitchen and drove home instead of to my office, which was unusual for me. And I sat in my car in my own driveway for close to 20 minutes without going inside. I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, that I had just learned 2 separate things in the span of one conversation. Not only that Marcus had opened a fraudulent credit card in my name 4 years earlier, but that my mother had known, had chosen silence, and had considered that silence a form of love. I did not yet know about the loan. I want to be honest that if I had stopped there, that week, I might genuinely have let it go, folded it into the long, familiar category of things my family did to keep the peace, and simply closed the account, absorbed the $11,000, the way I had absorbed everything else. I have thought about that a great deal since. I am not certain some nights whether that would have made me a better sister or simply a more exhausted one. The third wave was the loan, $85,000, forged in my name, timed with a precision that stopped feeling like coincidence the moment I laid the three events side by side on my kitchen table like exhibits. A financial history stretching back 8 years, a concealed credit card 4 years old, and now, a forged federal loan application, filed 19 days before I discovered it, 3 weeks before I was scheduled to stand in front of a federal judge on the most important case of my career, a case that required, as a condition of my continued good standing with the bar, a clean and verifiable financial record, subject to review. That detail matters more than almost any other in this story, so I want to say it plainly. An attorney representing plaintiffs in a federal wage case against a corporation, with the resources my opposing counsel had access to, does not get to have unexplained $85,000 loans and unusual credit inquiries appear on her record 3 weeks before trial. Opposing counsel does not need to disprove your case if they can simply raise enough doubt about your fitness to argue it. Marcus did not just steal money from me. Whether he understood it or not, and I would later learn, with total certainty, that he understood it exactly. He had handed my opposition a loaded weapon and left it sitting on the table 3 weeks before the fight of my life. I did not call him. I did not scream, and I did not cry, not because I am made of anything harder than anyone else, but because I have spent my entire adult life learning that the moment you let your hands shake, you lose control of the room. Instead, I opened a folder on my desktop. I gave it a 6-character name no one would ever guess. And I began building a case the way I build every case, quietly, patiently, and without a single document that could later be disputed as hearsay or emotion. I requested my full credit report from all 3 bureaus. I filed a fraud affidavit with the bank that issued the loan, which triggered, as I knew it would, an internal investigation with its own paper trail, separate from anything I controlled, a detail I would need later, because nothing convinces a room faster than evidence that did not originate from the person telling the story. I pulled the original loan application under a formal identity theft dispute, and there, buried in the metadata, the bank's compliance department eventually handed over under subpoena. I found the detail that changed the entire shape of what I thought I was dealing with. The application had not been filed 19 days before I found it. The account used to research and prepare the documentation, the fabricated pay stubs, the forged signature samples, practiced across 11 separate draft files before the final version was submitted, had been active for 4 months. 4 months of quiet, patient forgery, refined draft by draft, timed with what I can only describe as surgical precision to land 3 weeks before the one moment in my career I could least afford to be compromised. This had never been an act of desperation. Desperate people do not spend 4 months perfecting a signature. This was a plan. My brother had built a case against me with more preparation than some attorneys put into their opening arguments, and the client he was building it for was his own launch, his own applause, his own fresh start, funded, I would learn, entirely by the $85,000 sitting in an account with my name attached to the debt. I remember the exact moment the metadata loaded on my screen. Sitting in the small conference room at my firm, with a compliance officer from the bank on a video call, walking me through the account activity logs under the terms of the subpoena. There were 11 draft versions of the loan application, each one refining the forged signature slightly, each one adjusting a fabricated pay stub number by a few $100s to make the debt-to-income ratio pass an automated underwriting check. The earliest draft was dated 4 months before the loan closed. I asked the compliance officer, as calmly as I could manage, to repeat the date. She did. I wrote it down anyway. The way you write down something you already believe, simply to give your hand something to do while your understanding of a person rearranges itself completely. 4 months. 4 months of a man I had grown up with, sitting somewhere, at some desk, practicing my signature until it was good enough to fool an underwriting algorithm. 4 months of choosing, and re-choosing, to go through with something he could have abandoned at any single draft along the way. There is a version of this story where Marcus panics one night, makes a single reckless decision, and regrets it by morning. That is not what the evidence showed. What the evidence showed was patience. Revision. A man treating the theft of his sister's identity as a project worth getting right. And that was the moment the second half of the truth arrived, the half that hurt in a different, older place than the first half had. Because when I finally sat my mother down again, Not in the kitchen this time, but across the small conference table in my own office, where she could not retreat into the comfort of her own home, and asked her directly whether she had known anything about the loan before I found it. She did not deny it the way I expected her to. She looked at her hands for a long time. And then she said, very quietly, that Marcus had come to her 2 months earlier, frightened and tearful, and told her he needed to borrow against Camille's credit, just temporarily, just to get the company off the ground. She'll understand. She always understands. And my mother, who had spent a year secretly paying off a card she never told me about, had said nothing, had done nothing, had let 2 more months pass in silence while her son perfected a forgery aimed at her daughter's career, because, in her words, said without a single flinch of shame, I thought if it worked out, if the company took off, none of it would matter anymore. None of it would matter anymore. As though theft becomes retroactively forgivable if the thief eventually succeeds. As though my career, my name, my future in front of a federal judge, was simply collateral. My mother had quietly decided was an acceptable thing to spend, so long as it bought her son a chance at looking successful in a room full of strangers. I did not raise my voice at her. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect the climax of a story like this to be a screaming match in a kitchen, and mine was not. I simply looked at her for a long moment, the way you look at a witness whose testimony has just quietly and permanently changed the verdict in your head, and I said, "You knew, and you let the clock keep running," and then I stood up, and I thanked her for coming in, the way you thank anyone whose deposition you have just concluded, and I walked her to the door. I found out about Marcus's launch event the way you find out about most things you were never meant to know, through a mutual acquaintance who assumed, wrongly, that I would already have received an invitation from my own brother. His new firm, built around the promise of guiding small local businesses through financial restructuring, an irony I will let sit exactly where it lands, was set to launch at a private event on the top floor of a restored cotton warehouse near the harbor, in front of a room of local investors, 2 members of the city's Small Business Council, and, I would later confirm, a reporter from the Regional Business Journal, who had already agreed to run a feature on his bootstrap success story. The event was scheduled for the same week as my hearing. $85,000 of seed capital, dressed up in a blazer and a rehearsed origin story about grit and self-reliance, about to be presented to a room full of people who would never think to ask exactly whose signature had made that capital possible. I did not go to that event to make a scene. I want to be clear about that, because scenes are for people who have not yet built their case. I went because by then I had everything I needed: the fraud affidavit, the bank's internal investigation confirming forged documentation, the 4 months of draft files establishing premeditation, a formal police report I had filed the week before, and a civil complaint for identity theft and fraud that my own firm's litigation partner, at my request, had filed under seal that very morning. Time to become public record the moment I chose to let it. I stood near the back of that room, in a black suit I had worn to 3 depositions that same month, and I watched my brother take the small stage they had built near the harbor-facing windows. I watched him tap the podium 3 times with his index finger before he opened his mouth to speak. The same tell he'd had since he was 12 years old, denying a broken ceramic bird. And I watched him say, into a microphone, in front of 40 people holding champagne glasses, that he had built this company from nothing, on nothing but hard work and a family that always believed in him. I let him finish the sentence. I owed him nothing, but I have never in my life interrupted a man mid-lie when the truth was about to do far more damage arriving on its own schedule. The detective who had been assigned to my fraud case, a woman named Renata Ochoa, whom I had spoken with 3 times in the preceding 2 weeks, and who had confirmed to me only that morning that an arrest warrant had been issued based on the evidence I'd provided, walked into that room roughly 4 minutes after Marcus finished his toast. She did not raise her voice either. She simply walked up to him, near the harbor-facing windows, in front of the investors, in front of the reporter, in front of his wife, who I watched go pale and take 1 full step back from him before the detective had even finished speaking, and she informed him he was being placed under arrest for identity theft and financial fraud. I want to describe that room to you exactly as it was, because I have replayed it enough times since that I could draw you a map of it. Exposed brick on 3 walls, the original cotton warehouse beams still visible along the ceiling, string lights someone had clearly spent real money making look effortless. A jazz trio in the corner that stopped playing mid-phrase the moment Detective Ochoa crossed the room, the bassist's hands simply resting on the strings, unsure whether to keep going. I remember the exact shade of blue in Marcus's wife's dress, because it is the color I now associate, permanently and without my consent, with the specific sound of a room full of 40 people going silent at once. Marcus laughed. At first a short, confused laugh, the kind people make when they think a joke is being played on them at their own party. He said something like, "I think there's some mistake," and I watched his right hand drift. Out of 8 years of habit I had learned to read like a second language, toward the podium in front of him, 2 fingers already lifting to tap it 3 times before he'd even chosen his next lie. He never got the chance to finish the gesture. Detective Ochoa said his full legal name, stated the charges in a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as it needed to and no farther, and asked him to step away from the podium. I did not need to say a single word in that room. The $85,000 I had never touched said everything for me. What happened to Marcus afterward unfolded exactly the way documentation, once it exists in sufficient quantity, tends to unfold slowly at first, and then all at once. The investors who had gathered that night to fund his second round quietly withdrew every verbal commitment before the champagne had even gone flat. The Regional Business Journal never ran the feature. Instead, 3 weeks later, a much shorter article ran under a headline about a local financial consultant facing federal fraud charges, which is not the kind of press anyone can build a client base on. His firm, which had never technically opened for a single day of paying business, dissolved before it registered its first invoice. The criminal case moved slower than the collapse of his reputation, the way these things always do, but it moved. Identity theft charges, bank fraud charges, given the federal nature of the loan. A forgery charge layered on top, once the 4 months of drafted signatures were entered into evidence. His attorney, a man I recognized from the courthouse, and who avoided my eyes entirely the one time we passed each other in a hallway, attempted, at one point, to frame the entire matter as a family financial dispute, a phrase I found almost admirable in its dishonesty, given that family financial disputes do not typically require 4 months of forged pay stub templates. His wife left him during the 2nd month of the proceedings. I do not know the details of that conversation, and I did not ask, because some doors close in a life and it is not your place to stand outside them listening. What I do know is that the house they had bought together the year before, financed in part, I would later learn, by yet another loan he had taken out under his own name, against projected earnings from the company that never opened, went up for sale by the 4th month. I want to be honest about something here, because I think the version of this story people want is the version where the villain loses everything, and the hero feels nothing but clean, uncomplicated victory. That is not entirely true, and I am not interested in telling you a story that flatters me at the cost of being accurate. There was one night, the week before Marcus's sentencing hearing, when I sat alone in my office, long after everyone had gone home, and I found myself, unbidden, remembering him at 8 years old, teaching me to ride a bike in the alley behind our house, running alongside me with one hand on the back of the seat, promising he wouldn't let go, and not letting go, not once, until I could ride on my own. I do not tell you this to excuse what he did to me. I tell you this because the truth is rarely as clean as revenge stories like to pretend, and because I think it is worth admitting that the same person can teach you to ride a bicycle at 8 and forge your signature at 34, and that grief for the first version of someone does not disqualify you from holding the second version fully accountable. My mother did not go to the sentencing hearing. I did not ask her why. Some silences are easier to leave intact than to unpack in front of a courtroom full of strangers. The federal hearing I had spent 11 months preparing for took place exactly as scheduled, 3 weeks after I found that loan, in the same courthouse where, a little over a month later, my brother would stand for his own arraignment on an entirely different docket. I argued for 6 hours across 2 days on behalf of 37 families who had waited 6 years for someone to finally add up, publicly and under oath, every dollar a corporation had decided they were worth less than they actually were. I did not think about Marcus once while I was standing at that podium. I want that to be true, and it is true, because the version of myself who stands in front of a federal judge has never once, in 11 years of practicing law, allowed anything personal to walk into that room with her. That is not a skill I discovered because of what my brother did to me. It is the skill that let me survive what my brother did to me at all. We won. Not completely, not in the sweeping, cinematic way legal victories sometimes get portrayed, but in the way that actually matters: full back pay for 37 families, a consent decree requiring 3 years of independent payroll audits, and a public record, filed permanently with the federal court, establishing exactly what had been done to those workers and exactly what it had cost them. I do not know if any of them ever knew that the woman arguing their case had spent the 3 weeks before trial building a second case, in her spare hours, against her own brother. I never told them. It was never their weight to carry. 2 months after Marcus's sentencing, 18 months of probation, a restitution order for the full $85,000 plus the previously undisclosed credit card debt, and a permanent flag on his financial record that will follow him for the rest of his professional life. I drove to a pawn shop 40 minutes outside Charleston, the one whose receipt I had found folded into an old drawer at my parents' house during the second week of my investigation, back when I still believed the loan might be the whole story instead of merely its loudest chapter. My grandfather's pocket watch had sat in that shop's back case for the better part of a year, unclaimed, its ticket renewed twice by a shop owner who told me, when I finally came to collect it, that he'd simply never had the heart to sell off a stopped watch to a stranger who wouldn't understand what a stopped watch was worth. I paid what was owed on it. I did not ask Marcus how he had come to possess it or why he had chosen to pawn the one object in our family that had ever been given to me and me alone. Some questions are better left as evidence of character rather than as answers you actually need. I brought the watch home, cleaned the case myself at my kitchen table with a soft cloth, the way my grandfather used to, and set it on the corner of my desk at the office. Hands still stopped at the exact minute he died, exactly as it had always been, exactly as it was always supposed to stay. That same week, going through an old box of my mother's things she had asked me to help her sort, an olive branch of sorts, offered without either of us naming it as one, I found an old voicemail she had saved on a cassette answering machine tape from over a decade earlier, one of the only recordings that had survived 3 house moves. It was 4 seconds long. My mother's voice, younger, saying only, "Camille, honey, it's Mom. I just wanted to say I'm proud of you. Call me back." I do not know what prompted her to say it that particular day, over a decade ago, and I do not know why, out of every message on that tape, this was the one she had kept. I listened to it 3 times, alone in my car outside the courthouse, the night before Marcus's sentencing hearing. I have not listened to it since. I do not think I need to. I know it is there. People ask me sometimes, carefully. The way you ask a question you suspect might not have a comfortable answer. Whether I regret how far I let it go, whether there was a version of that night, 3 weeks before my hearing, where I could have simply called Marcus, confronted him quietly, let him pay the money back, let the whole thing stay a family matter, instead of a federal one. I have thought about this more than I have thought about almost anything else in my adult life, and here is the truest answer I can give you. The version of me who might have made that call had already been making that call, in one form or another, for 8 years. I had already spent $123,000 trying to keep this exact conversation from ever needing to happen out loud. What finally changed was not my brother's crime. It was my understanding of what silence had already cost me, quietly, for a decade, long before there was a number on a screen large enough to force me to add it all up. I think, often, about the people who spend the longest years of their lives quietly cleaning up after someone else, not because they are weak, but because they are the only ones capable enough to keep doing it without anyone noticing the cost. I was never protected in my family because I was fragile. I was used, gently and lovingly, and without a shred of malice on my parents' part, because I was strong enough not to break under the weight of it, and strength, in families like mine, is too often treated as a resource to be spent, rather than a person to be protected. So I will leave you with the only question that has actually mattered to me since that Tuesday night in my office. Not whether you would have done what I did, not whether you think I went too far, or not far enough, or exactly far enough and no further. I want to ask you something quieter than that. Something I still ask myself some nights, with the watch sitting stopped on the corner of my desk. Is there someone in your life whose consequences you have been quietly absorbing not because you want to, but because you are afraid of what will happen, to them or to you, the moment you finally stop? I don't have an answer for you. I only know that the night I stopped, I found out exactly how much it had been costing me to keep carrying it. And I have never, not once, in the time since, wished I had picked the phone back up.